Snow fell over London like a burial sheet the morning Lady Seraphina Vale walked toward the man who would destroy her reputation before the ink dried on the marriage registry. Every aristocrat packed inside St. Aurelius Cathedral already knew the scandal. The bride carried a child. The groom carried something worse. Duke Caedric Mordain of Blackmere had not spoken a single private word to the woman he was about to marry. Not during the arrangement, not during the engagement, not once. And when he finally opened his mouth at that altar, every person present understood that silence had been the kinder option. What he said next would follow Seraphina Vale for the rest of her life. Stay until the end of this story, because what that silence eventually cost him was far worse than anything it cost her. The cathedral smelled of hothouse lilies and old stone. Morning light fractured through stained glass and painted the nave in bruised violet and cathedral gold, turning the assembled faces of London's aristocracy into something resembling a gallery of Renaissance martyrs. 200 guests occupied the mahogany pews, every major house represented, every seat filled not by affection but by political calculation, because when the Duke of Blackmere summoned attendance, refusal carried consequences that outlived the evening. Seraphina walked the aisle alone. Her father had refused to escort her. Lord Philip Vale, once the most celebrated diplomat in the northern counties, had locked himself inside his study the morning the engagement was announced and communicated his position through his solicitor. 3 sentences. No daughter of mine walks toward that man with my blessing. She has made her arrangements. Let her live inside them. So she walked alone. Silver white silk moved against her body like frozen water. The gown had been constructed by the finest dressmaker in Mayfair, commissioned not by Seraphina, but by the Mordain estate, which meant it served the Duke's aesthetic rather than the bride's comfort. High-collared, severe, designed to communicate possession before the vows had even been spoken. Beneath the structured bodice, the faintest curve of early pregnancy pressed against whalebone stays, and every eye in the cathedral tracked that curve the way predators track wounded movement through grass. Seraphina kept her chin level. She did not smile. She did not tremble. She moved through the silence the way a woman moves through cold water when the only alternative is drowning, one measured step at a time, eyes fixed on the altar where the man responsible for her exile stood waiting. Duke Caedric Mordain looked less like a groom than a sentencing judge. He stood 6'3" in black ceremonial dress, every line of his body composed with the architectural precision of a man who understood that physical stillness communicated more authority than any speech. Dark hair swept back from a face built for severity. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from Blackmere granite, and eyes the color of frozen steel that had not blinked once since Seraphina entered the cathedral. He watched her approach the way a general watches an advancing column, not with warmth, not with anticipation, with assessment. The ceremony itself lasted 11 minutes. The archbishop moved through the liturgical requirements with the mechanical efficiency of a man who understood his role was decorative. No one present cared about the sacred dimensions of the union. This was a political merger sealed in flesh. Blackmere needed an heir. The Vale family needed financial rescue from debts so catastrophic they threatened to swallow 3 generations of accumulated land. The pregnancy had merely accelerated a transaction already in motion. When the final words were spoken, the archbishop turned toward Caedric. "You may address your bride, your grace." The duke's gaze moved to Seraphina for the first time since she had reached the altar. "You will possess my title, my estate, and my full protection, Duchess Mordain," he said. His voice carried through the cathedral without effort, the way thunder carries through open country. "But do not mistake ownership for affection. I have purchased stability, not companionship." The silence that followed was so complete the candle flames seemed to freeze. 200 aristocrats sat paralyzed between shock and fascination. Seraphina's expression did not change. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a wound, clinically, without flinching, as though she had already diagnosed the infection beneath the surface and was simply cataloging its depth. "As you command, your grace," she answered. Her voice was calm, not submissive, not broken. Calm the way deep water is calm, because everything dangerous exists beneath the surface. The reception lasted 4 hours. Caedric spoke to diplomats, financiers, and 3 members of the Privy Council. He did not speak to his wife. Not once. Serafina sat at the head table beside an empty chair and ate nothing while the assembled elite of London society dissected her humiliation over champagne and roasted pheasant. Lady Ashworth leaned toward Countess Pemberton at the third table. "He'll install a mistress within the month. The girl was merely a transaction." "The child won't carry legitimacy," Pemberton replied, adjusting her gloves. "Not with that display. He practically announced it was purchased." "Worse than purchased." Ashworth lowered her voice. "Tolerated." Serafina heard none of it. She sat in perfect stillness and studied the great hall's architecture instead, the flying buttresses, the hammer-beam ceiling, the way candlelight failed to reach certain corners where darkness pooled like standing water. She was already learning to read the grammar of the Mordain world. Stone and silence. Authority maintained through absence rather than presence. Control exercised not through visible force, but through the careful withdrawal of warmth. The architecture told her everything she needed to know about the man she had married. He had been raised inside structures designed to make human beings feel insignificant. At 11:30, Caedric's steward appeared at her elbow. "The Duke has departed, Your Grace." "Departed where?" "The continent. His Grace's carriage left for Dover 40 minutes ago." "And my travel arrangements?" The steward's expression flickered, just barely. The momentary crack of a man who understood cruelty when he witnessed it but lacked the authority to name it. "A separate carriage will convey you to Blackmere Keep at first light. The household has been instructed to receive you." "Instructed," Serafina repeated quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." She folded her napkin with geometric precision and placed it beside her untouched plate. "Then I suppose I should sleep. It seems I have a long journey ahead and no one to share it with." The steward said nothing. There was nothing to say. The carriage ride north took 3 days. Serafina traveled with a single maid, 2 trunks, and the growing certainty that she had married not a man, but an institution. The English countryside dissolved from gentle farmland into something harsher as the road climbed toward the northern territories. Hedgerows gave way to moorland. Soft green fields hardened into black soil and wind-stripped rock. The sky lowered until it pressed against the earth like a closed fist, and the temperature dropped steadily until frost began forming on the interior windows of the carriage. On the second evening, the maid, a young woman named Briggs, who had served the Vale household since childhood, attempted comfort. "The keep is said to be magnificent, my lady. One of the finest estates in the north." "Magnificent and warm are rarely the same thing, Briggs." "Perhaps it simply needs someone to warm it." Serafina watched the frozen landscape pass through the window. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps some places resist warmth the way some men resist honesty. Not because they cannot feel it, but because feeling it requires acknowledging everything they have survived without it." Briggs fell silent after that. Blackmere Keep materialized on the third morning like something conjured from nightmare. The fortress sat carved into cliff face above the North Sea, its towers disappearing into storm clouds that seemed permanently anchored to the stone. No approach road existed, only a narrow causeway of black rock that connected the keep to the mainland across a 200-foot drop into churning Atlantic water below. The carriage stopped at the causeway's edge. Serafina stepped out into wind so fierce it nearly tore the traveling cloak from her shoulders. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the structure that was now legally her home. Blackmere Keep did not welcome. It endured. The walls were 12 feet thick in places, constructed from dark granite quarried from the cliffs themselves, which meant the castle literally grew from the landscape like a geological extension of the coastline's fury. Arrow slits instead of windows on the lower floors. A single portcullis gate reinforced with iron that had turned black with centuries of salt air. No gardens. No ornamental landscaping. Nothing that suggested the people who built this place had ever considered beauty a priority. "My lady," Briggs whispered, her face white. "It looks like a prison." "It looks like a man who has never been loved," Serafina corrected quietly. "There is a difference. Prisons are designed to keep people in. This place was designed to keep the world out." She crossed the causeway without looking down. The household staff assembled in the great entrance hall numbered 14. 14 people to maintain a fortress that could have housed 300. They stood in rigid formation, faces blank with the particular emptiness of servants who had been trained through fear rather than loyalty. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, stepped forward. A woman of perhaps 60, built from the same granite as the walls, with steel-colored hair pulled back so tightly it seemed designed to prevent any expression from reaching her face. "Welcome to Blackmere Keep, Your Grace. The Duke has left instructions regarding your accommodation." "Has he?" "The East Wing has been prepared. Your rooms overlook the sea. Meals will be served in the small dining chamber at 7 and 1 and 7. The library and morning room are available for your use. The West Wing, the Tower, and the Duke's private chambers are not to be entered." Serafina absorbed this cartography of permission and restriction. "And if I have questions about the household?" "You may direct them to me, Your Grace. The Duke has placed management of domestic affairs under my authority." The message was clear. "You are a guest in your own home." "I see," Serafina said. "And how long has the Duke been absent from Blackmere, Mrs. Hargrove?" A pause. Barely perceptible, but Serafina caught it. "His Grace has not resided at the keep for 3 years, Your Grace." "3 years?" "Yes, Your Grace." Serafina looked around the entrance hall. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs hung from chandeliers that had not been lit in months. The hearth was cold. The air smelled of stone and salt and slow decay. "So for 3 years," she said evenly, 14 people have maintained an empty fortress under instructions from a man who refuses to live here, and no one has questioned whether those instructions still serve any purpose." Mrs. Hargrove's composure cracked. Not much. A fracture line through marble. "The Duke's instructions are not subject to question, Your Grace." "They are now." The silence that followed redistributed power throughout the room with the subtlety of an earthquake. "Light every hearth in the East Wing," Serafina continued. "Prepare the kitchens for actual use. I want an inventory of the pantry, the wine cellar, and the linen stores on my writing desk by morning." "And Mrs. Hargrove?" "Your Grace?" "I am not a guest. I am the Duchess of Blackmere. The distinction will matter before long." That first night, Serafina could not sleep. Wind screamed against the fortress walls with such violence that the stones themselves seemed to vibrate. The fire Briggs had built in the bedchamber fought against drafts that moved through the room like invisible inhabitants, and the sea crashed against the cliffs below with a rhythm that sounded less like nature than like something enormous trying to get in. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl and walked. The corridors of Blackmere stretched endlessly in both directions, lit only by occasional oil lamps that cast more shadow than illumination. Portraits of dead Mordain dukes lined the walls. Generations of hard faces staring from gilded frames with the collective warmth of a firing squad. She studied them as she passed. The first duke. A warlord whose portrait showed blood still wet on his gauntlets. The third duke. A man whose eyes contained the specific emptiness of someone who had signed execution orders before breakfast. The fifth duke, whose wife, according to the brass plate beneath the frame, had died at 23 under circumstances the family historian described as melancholic decline. Melancholic decline. The aristocratic vocabulary for a woman destroyed by the house she married into. Serafina stopped walking. She had reached the entrance to the West Wing, the forbidden territory. A heavy oak door banded with iron, locked with a mechanism that looked centuries old. She tested the handle. Locked. She knelt and examined the lock itself. A keyhole the size of her thumbnail, surrounded by scratches in the iron plate that suggested someone had opened and closed this door hundreds of times. The scratches were concentrated on the left side, consistent with the left-handed person inserting a key at a specific angle. Kedrick was left-handed. She had noticed during the ceremony. He had signed the marriage registry with his left. She returned to her chambers, retrieved the silver key she had discovered sewn into the lining of the traveling case the Mordain estate had provided, and walked back to the forbidden door. The key fit perfectly. Beyond the door, a narrow spiral staircase climbed into the tower. Serafina ascended. The room at the top was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with windows on every side that would have offered panoramic views of the sea and coastline had they not been shuttered and covered with heavy cloth. The air was different here. Stale, but not dead. Preserved, like the atmosphere inside a sealed vessel. She lit a candle from her chamber stick and discovered the childhood of the man she had married. Charcoal sketches covered every wall, hundreds of them, drawn directly onto the stone in a child's hand that gradually matured through layers of work, spanning what must have been years. Ships on rough seas, horses running through moorland, a woman's face, drawn over and over with obsessive repetition, Each version slightly different, but always the same subject. Dark hair, kind eyes, a mouth shaped for laughter that the artist seemed desperate to capture accurately, as though preserving her likeness was the only defense against forgetting her entirely. Serafina recognized the face from a small portrait she had seen in the entrance hall. Eleonora Mordan, Cadric's mother, dead before his 10th birthday. On a table beneath the shuttered windows, she found wooden soldiers with hand-painted uniforms, a collection of bird feathers pressed between pages of a Latin primer, and 17 letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes matched the kind-eyed woman in the sketches. She opened the first letter. "My dearest boy, you must understand something your father will never teach you. Strength that cannot bend will always shatter. The hardest stone in any quarry breaks first because it cannot absorb what strikes it. Be strong, Cadric, but never be so hard that you forget how to survive what life throws against you." Serafina read all 17 letters that night. They told the story of a mother who understood she was dying and used her remaining time to build a written architecture of love strong enough to sustain a child through whatever came after her death. Every letter addressed a different fear: loneliness, anger, the temptation to become cruel because cruelty felt safer than vulnerability. The final letter was dated 3 days before Eleanor's death. "Do not become your father. That is my only commandment. He mistakes silence for power and coldness for control. But silence is merely the sound fear makes when it runs out of words, and coldness is what happens to a heart that is forgotten. It was ever warm. You will be Duke. That cannot be changed, but you can choose what kind of man wears the title. Let that choice be yours, my love, not his." Serafina set down the letter. She understood now. Not everything, but enough. The cruelty at the altar, the abandonment, the forbidden rooms and the 3-year absence, the portrait of his mother drawn 100 times on the walls of a room no one else was allowed to enter. Cadric Mordain had not been born cruel. He had been built that way. Stone by stone, absence by absence, by a father who treated tenderness as structural weakness, and a world that rewarded emotional annihilation with power, influence, and the terrified obedience of everyone who crossed his path. The ruthless Duke was not a monster. He was a monument to what happens when a grieving child inherits an empire designed to punish softness. Standing in that hidden chamber, surrounded by the evidence of a loneliness so profound it had fossilized into authority, Serafina made a decision. She would not break against this fortress. She would not perform submission for a husband who had confused domination with connection. She would do something far more dangerous. She would make Blackmere live again. Over the following weeks, the fortress began to change. Serafina started with the kitchens. She dismissed the meager rations Mrs. Hargrove had maintained and ordered provisions from the village markets below the cliffs. Fresh bread, root vegetables, salted fish and dried herbs and cream thick enough to stand a spoon in. Within 3 days, the smell of rosemary broth drifted through corridors that had not known warmth in years. Mrs. Hargrove resisted, quietly at first, then directly. "The Duke's household budget does not accommodate extravagance, Your Grace." "Feeding people adequately is not extravagance, Mrs. Hargrove. It is the minimum expectation of any functioning household. What is the Duke's annual income from the Blackmere estates?" "I am not authorized to disclose financial particulars." "Then authorize yourself. I am your employer, not your adversary." "The Duke is my employer, Your Grace." Serafina set down her teacup with the particular precision of a woman reaching the limit of diplomatic patience. "Mrs. Hargrove, you have served this household faithfully for decades. I respect that service. But the man who gave you those instructions has not set foot in this castle for 3 years. He left a pregnant wife to travel alone through winter to reach a fortress he himself abandoned. Whatever loyalty you owe the Duke, you also owe the reality standing in front of you right now, and that reality is a woman who is not going anywhere." Something shifted behind the housekeeper's eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the first structural crack in a wall that had been standing too long, without maintenance. "The annual income is £12,000, Your Grace, before parliamentary deductions and estate obligations." "And the current household expenditure?" £1,100 annually. For a fortress of this size. The Duke preferred minimal operation. The Duke preferred absence. Minimal operation was simply the arithmetic of neglect. Mrs. Hargrove said nothing, but she did not argue. That was the beginning. Word traveled quickly. Within 2 weeks, villagers from the settlements below the cliffs began arriving at Blackmere's gates, not seeking charity, seeking the rumor. The new duchess gives shelter. The new duchess feeds the hungry. The new duchess lit the fires. Serafina turned no one away. Widows whose husbands had died in the fishing trade were given work in the kitchens and linen rooms. Orphaned children were housed in chambers that had stood empty for decades, their laughter echoing through corridors that had known nothing but silence and the winds howling. She commissioned repairs to the glass houses on the castle's sheltered southern face. Within weeks, green shoots appeared in soil that had lain fallow for years. The servants began calling her the Silver Duchess, not for her beauty, not for the pale gown she had worn at the wedding, because she was the first light Blackmere had seen since Eleanor Mordaunt died. Then came the letter from Paris. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by a courier who looked as though he had ridden through weather hostile enough to kill a lesser horse. The envelope bore the Mordaunt crest and was addressed in Cadric's handwriting, left-handed, precise. Every letter formed with the controlled pressure of a man who treated penmanship the way he treated everything else, as an exercise in discipline. Serafina opened it at her writing desk. 3 sentences. I am informed Blackmere has become hospitable. I did not authorize the expenditures. Cease immediately. She read the letter twice. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. Your Grace, Blackmere has not become hospitable. It has become inhabited. There is a difference, though I suspect the distinction is unfamiliar to you. The expenditures will continue. If you wish to discuss the matter further, you are welcome to return to the estate you abandoned and address your wife directly. I will not negotiate governance through couriers. Respectfully, Serafina Mordaunt, Duchess of Blackmere. She sealed the letter and handed it to the courier. Ride carefully, she told him. The Duke will not enjoy reading that. Days dissolved into the rhythm of reconstruction. Serafina worked alongside the household staff from dawn until the light failed. She learned the names of every servant, every villager, every child sheltered within the keep's walls. She studied the estate ledgers and discovered financial mismanagement spanning decades. Rents uncollected, tenant agreements exploited by intermediary agents who skimmed profits while the Duke's attention remained fixed on continental politics and parliament machinations. She corrected every discrepancy she found, quietly, methodically, the way a surgeon repairs damage without waking the patient. Then, on a frozen morning 6 weeks after her arrival, a delivery wagon appeared at the causeway gates. Inside it was a cradle, crafted from pale walnut lined with ivory silk, built with the kind of meticulous artistry that revealed weeks of careful labor. No letter accompanied it, no card, no explanation. But tucked inside the silk bedding, Serafina found a small embroidered blanket. Stitched into the fabric in thread so fine it was barely visible were 7 words. For the child who will never inherit my loneliness. Serafina held the blanket for a long time. Then she set it inside the cradle and placed the cradle beside the fire in her chamber, and sat there watching the flames without speaking until the light turned amber and the room filled with the particular warmth that only exists when something frozen begins, at last, to thaw. She pressed her hand against the curve of her belly. Your father, she whispered, is not the man he pretends to be, and one day I intend to prove it. The following week, the London newspapers arrived at Blackmere. Briggs brought them to the morning room with tea and toast, her expression carrying the particular tightness of someone delivering information they wished they could withhold. Serafina unfolded the front page. The headline struck like a blade. Duke of Blackmere seen with Lady Celestine Artois at Parisian salon. Political alliance or romantic attachment. Below the headline, a detailed account described Cadric attending 3 consecutive evening engagements in the company of Lady Celestine, a French-born financier whose beauty was matched only by her reputation for ruthless commercial intelligence. The article speculated with barely concealed delight about the nature of their relationship, noting that the Duke's new wife remained confined to the northern wilderness, while her husband enjoyed the pleasures of Parisian society. Serafina read the entire article. Then she folded the newspaper with surgical precision and placed it face down on the table. Briggs? Yes, my lady? Is the physician still in the village? Dr. Ashton? Yes, my lady. He arrived yesterday to treat Mrs. Hargrove's rheumatism. Send for him. Are you unwell, my lady? Serafina gripped the edge of the table. The first contraction moved through her body like a fault line splitting bedrock. "The baby is coming," she said. Outside, the sky had turned the color of iron. Wind screamed off the North Sea and threw itself against the cliffs with enough force to shake the windows in their frames. Within the hour, the first flakes of what would become the worst blizzard in Blackmere's recorded history began falling across the causeway, sealing the fortress from the mainland as completely as if the ocean had risen to swallow the road. Briggs ran for the physician. Mrs. Hargrove mobilized the household with a ferocity that revealed, beneath decades of controlled obedience, a woman who understood crisis the way soldiers understand incoming fire. And Serafina, gripping the cradle Kaedric had sent from across the continent, felt the second contraction tear through her with a violence that dropped her to her knees on the cold stone floor. The storm was just beginning. Somewhere beyond it, across frozen roads and hostile countryside and the entire breadth of a silence neither of them knew how to break, a man who had spent his entire life running from the thing he feared most had just received news that would send him riding through the night toward the one place he had sworn never to return. Blackmere Keep waited in the storm like a held breath, and the child who would change everything was already fighting to be born. The blizzard had teeth. Wind sheared across the North Sea at 60 miles an hour and slammed into Blackmere Keep with enough force to rattle iron hinges that had held firm for 4 centuries. Snow did not fall so much as a tack, driving horizontally through every gap in the fortress walls, piling against windows, burying the causeway beneath drifts that rose to 6 feet within the first hour. The temperature plummeted past anything the oldest servants could remember. Water froze inside pitchers. Breath crystallized before it left the mouth. The world beyond the castle walls ceased to exist. Inside the east wing bedchamber, Serafina was dying. Not literally, not yet. But the labor had gone wrong in the specific way that turned childbirth from miracle into mathematics. And the mathematics were ugly. Dr. Ashton, a man of 50 with hands steadied by 30 years of rural practice, had recognized the complication within minutes of his arrival. Breech presentation. The child had turned the wrong direction sometime during the final weeks, and now it pressed against Serafina's spine with a pressure that transformed each contraction from manageable agony into something closer to structural collapse. "I need you to breathe, Your Grace." Ashton's voice was controlled, but his eyes moved too quickly between Serafina's face and Briggs, who stood at the foot of the bed gripping fresh linen with white knuckles. "Shallow breaths. Count with me." "I can count on my own, Doctor." "I have no doubt, but cooperation tends to produce better outcomes than independence in these situations." Serafina's jaw locked as another contraction rolled through her. The sound she made was not a scream. It was something more private than that, more animal, the noise a body produces when it encounters pain beyond the range of language. Her fingers twisted into the bedsheets hard enough to tear the Egyptian cotton the Mordain estate had imported at absurd expense from a London supplier, who probably imagined these linens would cradle gentle sleep rather than absorb this particular war. Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. "The causeway is impassable. If the storm continues through the night, we will be sealed in until morning at the earliest." "And the secondary physician in the village?" "Cannot cross. The drifts are above the stone railings now." Ashton absorbed this information without changing expression. A good physician learns early that panic is contagious and far more dangerous than most diseases. "Then we manage with what we have. Mrs. Hargrove, I need hot water replenished every 20 minutes, clean cloth. And whatever laudanum remains in the household stores." "No." Serafina's voice cut through the room. "No laudanum." "Your Grace, the pain will intensify considerably before—" "I said no." She dragged herself upright against the headboard, sweat streaming down her face, her silver-pale hair plastered to her neck. "I need to feel everything. If something goes wrong, I need to know before you do." Ashton studied her for a long moment. He had delivered perhaps 400 children in his career, stillborn and screaming, peasant cottages and manor houses. He had watched mothers negotiate with agony in every conceivable way, through silence and prayer and rage and surrender. But he had never seen a woman treat pain as intelligence, as information to be processed rather than endured. "As you wish, Your Grace." The hours crawled. Midnight passed. Then 1. Then 2. The blizzard did not weaken. If anything, it intensified, the wind reaching frequencies that made the stone walls hum like the hull of a ship taking broadside waves. Candles guttered and flared. Shadows lunged across the ceiling. The fire in the hearth consumed logs at a rate that forced Briggs to resupply every 30 minutes, moving between the woodpile and the bedchamber with the mechanical repetition of a woman who understood that stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean terror. Between contractions, Serafina's mind moved through the corridors of its own architecture. She thought about her father, the study door locked, the solicitor's message, 3 sentences to sever 23 years of parenthood. She thought about the women in the portraits downstairs, the wives of dead Mordain dukes whose histories had been compressed into brass plates that said nothing about who they were and everything about how they ended. Melancholic decline, consumption, childbed fever. The aristocratic feminine reduced to a series of elegant destructions. She thought about the cradle beside the fire, pale walnut, ivory silk. 7 embroidered words from a man who could not speak tenderness aloud, but had apparently commissioned it from a craftsman and shipped it across international borders. For the child who will never inherit my loneliness. The contraction that hit at 3 a.m. changed everything. Ashton's hands moved with sudden urgency. His expression, so carefully controlled for hours, shifted into something Serafina recognized because she had worn it herself at the altar, the face of a person recalculating reality in real time. "The child has moved," he said. "Moved how?" "The shoulder is presenting. I need to intervene manually." "Then intervene." "Your Grace, this procedure is painful beyond anything you have experienced tonight." Serafina looked at him. Her eyes were bloodshot, ringed with exhaustion, burning with something that had nothing to do with fever. "Doctor, I walked alone into a cathedral full of people who wanted to see me humiliated. I traveled 3 days through winter to reach a fortress my husband abandoned. I have spent 6 weeks rebuilding an empire on £1,100 a year while carrying a child whose legitimacy half of London has already questioned. Do not tell me about pain. Tell me what you need me to do." Ashton nodded once. "Hold still. Breathe only when I tell you. And forgive me." What followed lasted 9 minutes. Serafina screamed twice. The second time, something tore inside her that she would never fully recover from, a physical cost that would announce itself in the years ahead through chronic pain that no physician could fully explain and no medicine could fully address. The body's receipt for survival. The tax levied on women who endure what should have killed them and continue living anyway. At 17 minutes past 3, the child turned. At 22 minutes past 3, the child crowned. At 3:29 in the morning, in a fortress sealed by storm at the edge of the known world, Serafina Mordain's son entered existence screaming with a fury that silenced even the wind. Ashton caught the infant with practiced hands and cleared the airway and waited for the breathing to stabilize and then placed the child against Serafina's chest without ceremony. "A boy," he said, healthy, loud, evidently inherited the Mordain temperament. Serafina looked down at her son. He was red-faced and furious and perfect. She pressed her lips against his forehead and closed her eyes, and for exactly 11 seconds allowed herself the luxury of feeling absolutely nothing except the impossible warmth of a new life against her skin. Then the exterior doors of Blackmere Keep exploded open 3 floors below. The sound carried through the fortress like cannon fire. Stone corridors amplified the impact until it reached the bedchamber as a deep percussive shudder that rattled the medicine bottles on Ashton's tray. Briggs dropped the water basin. Mrs. Hargrove turned toward the door with an expression that combined professional alarm with something older and more personal. Recognition. "He is here," she said. Boots on stone, moving fast, taking stairs 2 at a time with the desperate rhythm of a man who has been riding for days through conditions that should have stopped him permanently. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the harsh rasp of breathing pushed past the body's ordinary limits. The bedchamber door hit the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Cadric Mordain stood in the doorway. He was destroyed. There was no other word for it. Snow caked his riding coat from collar to hem. His hair was plastered to his skull with frozen sweat. His lips were cracked and blue-white from exposure. The gloves he wore had split across both palms from gripping reins through conditions that should have killed the horse beneath him, and the horse had in fact collapsed 2 miles from the causeway, forcing him to cover the remaining distance on foot through chest-deep snow and absolute darkness. He looked like a man who had fought the storm itself and won by a margin so thin it barely counted. His eyes found Serafina immediately. then the infant, then back to Serafina. For 3 full seconds, the ruthless Duke of Blackmere did not move, did not speak, did not breathe. Every mechanism of control that had governed his life since childhood, every wall constructed, every emotion suppressed, every vulnerability converted into authority, all of it seized simultaneously like an engine pushed past its tolerances. "Get out," he said to the room. No one moved. "All of you, now." Ashton looked at Serafina. She nodded once. The physician gathered his instruments. Briggs collected the soiled linen. Mrs. Hargrove paused at the door long enough to look back at the Duke with an expression that contained decades of unspoken observation, the accumulated testimony of a woman who had watched a boy become a man, become a monument, and was now watching the monument crack. The door closed. Cadric crossed the room. He moved differently than Serafina had ever seen him move. Not with the calculated precision of a man performing authority, with the raw, uncoordinated urgency of someone whose body had finally outpaced his ability to control it. He reached the bedside and his knees buckled, and he went down hard on the stone floor beside her, still wearing the frozen riding coat, still breathing in sharp, ragged pulls that fogged the air between them. "Look at me," he said. His voice was barely functional, stripped by cold and exhaustion and something else. Something underneath both that he had been carrying across 2 countries and 300 miles of winter road. Serafina looked at him. His eyes were not cold. They were not steel. They were the eyes of a man staring at something he had spent his entire life convinced he would never possess, and terrified that seeing it clearly would be the thing that finally annihilated him. "You are alive," he said. "I am." "The child?" "Your son. Healthy." Cadric's gaze dropped to the infant cradled against her chest. The baby had stopped crying, and now breathed with the shallow, rapid rhythm of the newly born, eyes squeezed shut, fists clenched, utterly unaware of the dynasty he had just entered, or the man kneeling beside him whose hands were shaking too badly to reach for him. "I received word in Paris," Cadric said. "A letter from Mrs. Hargrove. She wrote that the labor had begun early, and the physician was concerned about complications." "Mrs. Hargrove wrote to you?" "She has written to me every week since you arrived. Every detail. The kitchens, the provisions, the villagers, the children you sheltered, the fires you lit." He swallowed. "The letter you sent telling me to come home and address my wife directly. And you ignored all of it. Until now." "I ignored none of it." Something in his voice stopped her. "Every letter arrived in Paris within 3 days. I read each one the night it came. Then I read them again the following morning. I have read your words to me so many times the paper has begun to deteriorate from handling." His jaw tightened. "I have not ignored you, Serafina. I have been terrified of you since the moment you answered me at that altar without breaking." The fire cracked. Embers scattered across the hearthstones. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the fortress, but inside the chamber the air had changed. Something was collapsing. Not violently, the way a dam collapses when the water behind it has been rising for years, and the structure simply cannot hold any longer. "You humiliated me," Serafina said. Not with anger, with precision. "In front of 200 people, you told the world that marrying me was a financial transaction, that I purchased protection by surrendering dignity. You said that in a room full of people who already believed I was disgraced, and you handed them permission to treat me accordingly." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I am my father's construction." "That is not an answer. That is an excuse wearing the clothing of self-awareness." The words hit him like a physical blow. She watched it land, watched his entire body absorb the impact the way she had seen the fortress walls absorb the storm. Through sheer density of material, the way men built from emotional granite take damage without showing fracture until the structural failure is already catastrophic. "I meant every word I said at that altar," Cadric said slowly. "And I have regretted every word since the moment they left my mouth. Both things are true simultaneously. The cruelty was real. The regret is also real. I do not know how to reconcile them. I have never known." "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." "It is the most honest thing I have ever said to anyone." Silence. The kind that exists between 2 people who have arrived at the same dangerous intersection from opposite directions and understand that what happens next will determine whether they collide or find a way to move forward without destroying each other. Serafina shifted the infant in her arms. Hold your son. Kedrick did not move. Kedrick, hold your son. He reached forward. His hands were still trembling. He took the child with the terrified delicacy of a man handling something he believed he was fundamentally unfit to protect, and the moment the infant's weight settled against his chest, something happened to his face that Serafina would remember for the rest of her life. It did not soften. It opened. The mask did not fall away because it was never simply a mask. It was load-bearing architecture. Without it, the structure beneath was visible for the first time, and what lived underneath was not cruelty or calculation or the cold machinery of power. It was grief, old grief. The kind that starts in childhood and calcifies through decades of silence until it becomes indistinguishable from the person carrying it. The grief of a boy who lost his mother before he understood what mothers were for, and then spent 30 years building an empire out of the materials available to him, which were stone, discipline, and the complete refusal to need anything he could not control. He looked at his son. The infant yawned, and the Duke of Blackmere pressed his forehead against the child's and breathed in the scent of new skin and closed his eyes and said nothing because there was nothing in any language he knew that could carry the weight of what he felt. I was taught that love weakens rulers, he said finally, his voice barely audible. My father said it once when I was 7. I had been crying because my mother had been dead for 3 months, and I could not stop dreaming about her. He pulled me from the bed by my collar and told me that Mordain men do not weep, that grief is a luxury reserved for people who cannot afford power, that the moment I chose feeling over function, I would lose everything the family had built. He opened his eyes. I believed him. For 25 years, I believed every word. And now I am holding my son in a castle I abandoned because returning to it meant confronting every room where she once lived. And I cannot make myself put him down because I am afraid that if I stop holding him, I will go back to being the man who stood at that altar and told the only woman who ever made this place bearable that she was a transaction. Serafina watched him. She did not soften. She did not rush to comfort. She had learned something about herself during the weeks alone at Blackmere that most people never discover because most people are never abandoned thoroughly enough to find out. Compassion without accountability was just another form of surrender, and she had not survived the altar, the journey, the fortress, the labor, and the storm to surrender now. You cannot unsay what you said at the cathedral, she told him. You cannot undo the weeks I spent here alone wondering whether the father of my child had already replaced me with a Parisian financier. You cannot repair humiliation with a single night of honesty, Kedrick. The damage is structural. I know. Lady Celestine. His head came up. Celestine Artois controls the largest private banking network in continental Europe. I sought her partnership to restructure debts my father accumulated over 40 years of financial brutality. Debts that would have consumed Blackmere within 18 months had they remained unaddressed. She is not my lover. She has never been my lover. She is 71 years old and has been managing the estates of insolvent aristocrats since before I was born. 71. The newspapers described a beautiful French companion because beautiful French companions sell more copies than elderly financial restructuring specialists. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the blood, the torn muscles, the 18 hours of labor and the weeks of isolation and the months of humiliation, Serafina laughed. It was not a large laugh, not dramatic, just a single involuntary sound that escaped before she could stop it, the way pressure escapes through a crack in a vessel that has been sealed too tightly for too long. Kedrick stared at her. You are laughing. I am laughing at the idea that I spent 3 weeks torturing myself over a 71-year-old banker. She is very formidable. I am sure she is. Something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, nothing that clean or simple, but a recalibration. Two people who had been speaking different languages since the day they met, discovering for the first time that they shared enough vocabulary to build something that might eventually hold weight. The infant began crying again. Serafina reached for him. Kedrick transferred the child carefully, and during the exchange their hands met, and neither pulled away. I read your mother's letters, she said. His entire body went rigid. The tower room, the sketches, the wooden soldiers, all of it. I found them the first week. Those rooms were locked. The key was in the traveling case your estate provided, sewn into the lining. That is impossible. I never... He stopped. His expression changed. Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove. She placed the key. She has been managing you longer than you realize, Kadric. The letters to Paris, the key in my luggage. She has been quietly engineering your surrender for months. Kadric sat back on the stone floor. He looked toward the door through which the housekeeper had departed minutes ago, and his expression contained the specific bewilderment of a man who has just discovered that the person he believed was his most obedient servant was in fact the most patient strategist in the building. My mother hired her, he said quietly. I know, she told me. What else did she tell you? That your mother's final instruction was to protect you from yourself, and that she has been waiting 30 years for someone to arrive who could finish the work she started. The fire had burned down to deep red coals. The storm outside continued, but its fury had peaked hours ago and now retreated slowly, the wind dropping from a roar to a moan to something almost resembling exhaustion. Snow still fell, but gently now, covering the violence of the blizzard with soft white silence. In the bedchamber of Blackmere Keep, a man who had never held anything without calculating its strategic value held his sleeping wife's hand while their newborn son breathed between them, and for the first time in his adult life made no attempt to convert the moment into power. But power, as Kadric understood better than anyone alive, does not pause because a man discovers he is capable of tenderness. And 700 miles south, in a London office paneled in dark oak and lit by gas lamps that turned the occupant's face into something carved from amber shadow, Lord Cassian Mordain, Kadric's cousin and the most dangerous political mind in Parliament, opened a leather folio containing documents that would destroy everything the Duke of Blackmere had built. A formal challenge to the legitimacy of the newborn heir, filed with the Lord Chancellor's office that morning. Cassian poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and read the filing one final time. Welcome to fatherhood, cousin, he said to the empty room. Let us see how tenderness performs against statute law. He closed the folio, and the war for Blackmere moved from the battlefield of marriage into the only arena where love had never once won a single decisive engagement. The courts of the British Empire. The documents arrived at Blackmere Keep on a morning so still the sea looked like hammered pewter. No wind, no waves. The kind of silence that settles over a landscape when the atmosphere itself is holding something back, waiting for the right moment to release it. Serafina noticed it first because she had learned to read weather the way she once read diplomatic correspondence, as intelligence, as data about what was coming and how much time remained to prepare. She was standing in the restored kitchen garden when the courier appeared at the causeway gates. 3 weeks had passed since the birth, 3 weeks since the storm, 3 weeks since Kadric had knelt on the stone floor of her bedchamber and spoken more honest words in a single night than he had produced in the entirety of their acquaintance. The bruises of labor were fading. The child whom they had named Edmund after no one in particular because Serafina refused to continue the Mordain tradition of naming heirs after dead tyrants, had settled into the furious regularity of an infant who ate, screamed, slept, and screamed again with a consistency that suggested he had already developed opinions about the world and found it inadequate. Kadric had remained at Blackmere. That fact alone had restructured the domestic reality of the fortress more profoundly than anything Serafina had accomplished in her weeks of solitary renovation. The Duke in residence meant the staff moved differently, spoke differently. Mrs. Hargrove maintained her granite composure, but something had loosened in the way she addressed the household, a slight warming that communicated itself through details so small only someone trained to read institutional power dynamics would have noticed. An extra log on the fire without being asked. Tea prepared 5 minutes before the Duke's habitual waking time rather than 5 minutes after. The invisible choreography of a household that has detected a shift in its governing architecture and is adjusting accordingly. Kadric himself occupied an uncertain territory between the man he had been and whatever he was becoming. He worked from the study each morning, managing correspondence and estate business with the brutal efficiency that had always characterized his administrative style, but twice daily he appeared in the nursery. He did not hold the child often. He stood near the cradle and watched Edmund sleep with an expression that reminded Serafina of the charcoal sketches in the tower room, the same obsessive attention, the same desperate attempt to memorize something he feared would be taken from him. They had not discussed the future. They had not discussed the past beyond the raw confession of that single night. They occupied the same fortress, ate at the same table, inhabited the same silence, but the distance between them remained precisely calibrated, close enough to acknowledge change, far enough to avoid the vulnerability that closing it entirely would require. Then the courier arrived. Kydrick received the documents in his study. Serafina knew something was wrong before he spoke because she heard his chair scrape against the stone floor, a sharp, involuntary movement from a man whose physical vocabulary did not include involuntary movements. She was passing the study door when it happened. She stopped. "Kedrick." No answer. She entered without knocking. He stood behind the desk holding 3 sheets of heavy legal parchment. His face had undergone the specific transformation she had witnessed only once before, at the altar, when he had converted whatever he actually felt into something cold enough to weaponize. But this was different. At the altar, the coldness had been deliberate, performed. This was reactive. The coldness of a man whose blood temperature had dropped because the information he was processing required his entire nervous system to reroute resources away from emotion and towards survival. "What is it?" He set the documents on the desk. "Cassian has filed a legitimacy challenge against Edmund with the Lord Chancellor's court." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Serafina felt the impact spread through her body in concentric rings, each one carrying a different frequency of understanding. Legal, financial, political, personal. By the time the final ring reached the edges of her awareness, she understood the full architecture of the threat. On what grounds? 3 grounds. First, that the child was conceived prior to marriage, which, under the Mordaunt family charter, creates a rebuttable presumption of illegitimacy, requiring the Duke to prove paternal claim through formal testimony and corroborating evidence. Second, that my absence from England during the pregnancy constitutes abandonment of marital duty, which Cassian argues creates an inference that I did not believe the child was mine. Third, Kedrick's voice flattened to something barely recognizable, that Serafina Vale was observed in private company with Lord Henry Ashworth in the months preceding the engagement. The third ground struck differently. Henry Ashworth. Yes. Your cousin is accusing me of adultery. He is accusing you of sufficient intimacy with another man to cast doubt on the paternity of my heir. Under succession law, that distinction is meaningless. The accusation alone is enough to trigger a full tribunal. Serafina sat down. Not because her legs failed, because the calculation she needed to perform required absolute physical stillness, the way a navigator needs a stable platform to take accurate readings during a storm. Henry Ashworth. She had danced with him twice at the Pemberton Ball the autumn before the engagement, once at the insistence of the hostess. Once because Henry had asked and refusing would have created exactly the kind of social rupture that a woman in her position could not afford. 2 dances, perhaps 15 minutes of total interaction. The sum of her entire acquaintance with the man. I danced with Henry Ashworth, she said, twice, in a room containing 300 people. That is the entirety of my association with him. I know. You know. I had you watched, Serafina, from the day the engagement was formalized until the day of the ceremony. Every social engagement, every caller, every letter. My solicitors maintained surveillance because I needed to ensure that the child you carried was mine before I committed the Mordain name and estate to a marriage that could not be dissolved. She stared at him. The silence that followed was not the productive silence of 2 people processing information together. It was the silence of a woman discovering that the man who had accused her of being a transaction had in fact treated her as one long before the altar. Surveillance, reports, dossiers compiled on her social movements by hired men whose profession existed at the intersection of law and espionage. You had me followed. Yes. While I was pregnant with your child. Yes. And you found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The reports were comprehensive and entirely exculpatory. Henry Ashworth was never anything more than a social acquaintance. And you married me knowing that. I married you knowing that. Then you stood at the altar and told 200 people I was a transaction anyway. Kedrick did not answer immediately. The muscle in his jaw worked once, twice, the only visible evidence of whatever internal machinery was grinding through the contradiction she had just illuminated. He had possessed proof of her fidelity before the wedding. He had married her knowing she was innocent, and then he had publicly degraded her regardless, not because the facts demanded it, but because his own psychological architecture could not process the alternative. Admitting that he was marrying a faithful woman carrying his legitimate child would have required admitting that the marriage was real, that it mattered, that he was entering a bond defined by something other than power, and contractual obligation. The cruelty at the altar had not been about Serafina at all. It had been about him. His inability to stand before witnesses and acknowledge that he wanted what he was receiving. Cassian does not have the Ashworth evidence, Kedrick said finally. He has rumor, speculation manufactured from social proximity and weaponized through legal procedure. But in a legitimacy tribunal, rumor is enough to compel testimony. Henry Ashworth will be called to the stand. If Cassian's advocates are competent, and they will extract admissions of private conversation, of familiarity, of any fragment that can be recontextualized as intimacy. Henry Ashworth has nothing to admit. Henry Ashworth is a gambling addict who owes £11,000 to creditors who have been circling his estate for 2 years. Cassian has almost certainly purchased his cooperation. The testimony will not be truthful. It will be economically motivated. Serafina absorbed this. The geometry of the trap was elegant. She could see it the way she had learned to see the architecture of Blackmere, structurally, load-bearing walls and pressure points, and the locations where force applied in precisely the right direction could bring down the entire edifice. Cassian did not need to prove adultery. He needed only to create sufficient legal ambiguity around Edmund's paternity to trigger a succession crisis. Once triggered, the crisis would paralyze Blackmere's financial networks, freeze the debt restructuring Kedrick had arranged through Lady Celestine, embolden the political rivals already circling in Parliament, and create the conditions for a forced transfer of the ducal title to the next eligible male heir. Lord Cassian Mordain. This is not about Edmund, Serafina said. No. This is about the title, the estate, Blackmere itself. Cassian has wanted the duchy since we were children. He lacks the temperament for direct confrontation, so he fights through institutions instead. Courts, parliamentary committees, legal technicalities. He is patient the way geological forces are patient. He does not need to win quickly. He needs to win permanently. How long before the tribunal? 6 weeks. The filing was made 3 days ago. The Lord Chancellor has scheduled preliminary hearings for the first week of March. 6 weeks. Serafina looked toward the window. Outside, the kitchen garden she had built was showing the first signs of early spring growth, green shoots pressing through dark soil, the stubborn insistence of living things refusing to accept that winter was still the dominant force. We need allies, she said. Not solicitors, not barristers, allies with political weight in the Lord Chancellor's court. I have spent 15 years accumulating political allies, Serafina, and I can tell you with complete certainty that political allies are the first casualties of a legitimacy challenge. The moment Cassian filed, every man who has ever owed me a favor began calculating whether supporting me or abandoning me would produce better returns. Then we need something else. What? The truth, told so loudly and so publicly that the tribunal becomes theater instead of adjudication. Kedrick studied her. You want to turn the hearing into a spectacle. I want to turn the hearing into an execution of Cassian's credibility, of the rumor, of every comfortable assumption London society has made about me since the day that pregnancy became public knowledge. That strategy requires me to testify. Yes, publicly, before peers, about matters I have never discussed with anyone. You discussed them with me 3 weeks ago, on the floor of my bedchamber while you held your son for the first time. That was different. How? That was private. Nothing about this family has ever been private, Kedrick. Your father made certain of that. The question is not whether you are willing to be exposed. You are already exposed. Cassian has seen to that. The question is whether you choose the terms of your own exposure or whether you allow your cousin to dictate them. He turned away from her and walked to the window. The study overlooked the North Sea, and from this height the water stretched endlessly toward the horizon, gray and relentless and indifferent to every human ambition ever projected onto its surface. Kedrick pressed his palm flat against the glass. His breath fogged the cold surface and erased the view for a moment before it cleared again. My father testified before Parliament once, he said. A financial inquiry. He was accused of misappropriating estate revenues through shell investments in colonial enterprises. The evidence against him was substantial. 15 witnesses, documented transactions, a paper trail that any competent investigator could have followed to conviction. What happened? He destroyed them, not through denial, through aggression. He attacked the character of every witness, exposed the financial vulnerabilities of every accuser, turned the inquiry into a referendum on the credibility of his opponents rather than the legality of his own conduct. By the end, the committee withdrew the investigation, and 3 of the witnesses had fled London to avoid the political consequences of having challenged him. And you learned from that. I learned that truth is not a fixed point. It is a weapon whose effectiveness depends entirely on who wields it and how much damage they are willing to inflict. My father understood that. Cassian understands it. The question is whether I am willing to use truth the way they use it, as ordnance, or whether I attempt something I have never attempted in my life. Which is? Using truth as truth, without calculation, without strategic deployment, simply standing before the tribunal and saying what is real and accepting whatever follows. He turned from the window. His face held an expression Serafina had never seen on any Mordain. Not in the portraits, not in the tower sketches, not in the mirror of Caedric's own carefully managed features during any moment of their shared history. Fear. Not the performative fear of a man who understands that appearing vulnerable can be strategically useful. The genuine terror of a human being confronting the possibility that the survival mechanisms which have kept him alive for 35 years might be the very things that destroy everything he has left. If I testify honestly, he said, I will have to admit what I said at the altar, publicly, before peers who will use that admission as evidence of my character. I will have to explain that I humiliated my wife because I was too damaged to accept love when it was offered. I will have to describe the surveillance, the reports on your social life, the calculated degradation of a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. Every mechanism of control I have ever employed will be exposed under oath as the pathology it actually is. Yes. And if that testimony fails to convince the tribunal, Cassian will use my own confession to finish what the legitimacy challenge started. He will paint me as a man so fundamentally broken that the court has no choice but to remove the duchy from my control for the protection of the child. Yes. So I am being asked to choose between 2 forms of destruction. Silence, which allows Cassian to define the narrative, or honesty, which hands him ammunition he could never have manufactured on his own. Serafina stood. She crossed the study and stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the fatigue in her eyes, the residual pallor from a birth that had nearly killed her, the steel beneath both that had been forged not by privilege or breeding, but by the simple, sustained act of surviving conditions designed to break her. You are not being asked to choose between 2 forms of destruction, she said. You are being asked to choose between the man your father built and the man your mother hoped you would become. That is the only choice. Everything else is arithmetic. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the fire to settle and send a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Prepare the household for London, Caedric said. We travel in 3 days. The baby is 3 weeks old. Then we travel carefully, but we travel. Cassian has chosen his ground. I intend to meet him on it before he has time to fortify his position. He picked up the legal documents from the desk. And Serafina. Yes. I need Mrs. Hargrove to bring me every letter she sent to Paris, every one, including the ones I did not respond to. Why? Because those letters are the only documentary evidence that exists of a man paying attention to his wife and child from a distance he was too much of a coward to close. They will not prove paternity, but they will prove something the tribunal is not expecting to encounter from a Mordain. What? That I cared, silently, badly, through entirely inadequate channels, but consistently, from the beginning. He left the study. Serafina stood alone in the room for a long time afterward. Then she walked to the nursery, lifted Edmund from his cradle, and held him against her chest while she looked out the window at the causeway stretching toward the mainland like a narrow bridge between 2 versions of the future, one in which the name Mordain meant what it had always meant, and one in which it might, for the first time in its history, mean something worth inheriting. 3 days later, the Mordain household departed Blackmere Keep for London. The carriage carried Caedric, Serafina, Edmund, Briggs, and a traveling case containing 47 letters, 1 ancient silver key, and the embroidered blanket from a walnut cradle. The journey south took 2 days. They did not speak much, not because the silence between them had reverted to its former coldness, but because the silence had changed composition. It was no longer the silence of 2 people avoiding each other. It was the silence of 2 people preparing for the same fight from different positions, each running private calculations about what the coming weeks would require and what they were willing to sacrifice to survive them. On the second evening, as the carriage approached the outskirts of London, Seraphina broke the quiet. "Cedric, if Cassian's people have purchased Henry Ashworth's testimony, there may be others. I know. People from my past, from before the engagement, anyone who can be pressured or bought. I have already instructed my solicitors to identify potential witnesses and assess their vulnerabilities." "That is not what I mean." She turned toward him in the dim interior of the carriage. "I mean that when this tribunal begins, every private moment of my life before I became your wife will be examined under public scrutiny by men who have no interest in the truth and every interest in its destruction. I need to know that you will not retreat from me when that happens. Retreat. Withdraw. Recalculate. Decide that the political cost of defending me exceeds the strategic value of maintaining the marriage. I have watched you perform that calculation before, Cedric, at the altar. When you chose institutional survival over human decency because the numbers favored it." The carriage rattled over cobblestones as London materialized around them. Gaslights appeared through the windows. The smell of coal smoke and horse dung and the particular density of 10,000 chimneys burning simultaneously replaced the clean salt air of the northern coast. Cedric looked at his wife. "I will not retreat," he said. "Promise me." A Mordain's promise is worth exactly what the man behind it is worth. 3 months ago, my promise would have been worthless. You know that. I know that. And now? He reached across the carriage and took her hand. Not gently, not with tenderness. With the grip of a man seizing something he has decided to hold regardless of what it costs. "Now I am telling you that I will stand in that tribunal and say things that will make me unrecognizable to every person who has ever known me. I will dismantle 35 years of carefully constructed authority in front of peers who will never respect me the same way again. I will do this because my son's future depends on it, because you deserve it, and because I am finished being the man my father designed." His grip tightened. "That is not a promise. It is a statement of operational intent. And I have never once failed to execute an operation I committed to." The carriage rolled through the London gates. Ahead of them, Parliament waited like a stone jaw preparing to close. Behind them, Blackmere Keep stood empty on its cliff, holding its breath above the sea the way it had held its breath for centuries, waiting to see whether the family that bore its name would survive what was coming or become another entry in the long archive of dynasties that destroyed themselves from within. And somewhere in the city they were entering, in a house on Curzon Street lit by gaslight and filled with documents designed to bury them, Lord Cassian Mordain received word that the Duke and Duchess of Blackmere had arrived in London with their infant son. He set down his wine glass. He smiled. "Excellent," he said to his solicitor. "Let them come. The tribunal is designed for exactly one outcome, and it was decided long before they left the north." The solicitor shifted in his chair. "My lord, we have received additional intelligence. The Duchess has been in contact with Lady Celestine Artois. A series of financial documents may be entering evidence that we did not anticipate." Cassian's smile did not change. "Then we accelerate the Ashworth testimony. Whatever the Duchess has constructed financially, it becomes irrelevant the moment the tribunal accepts testimony that the child is not the Duke's." "And if the Duke testifies?" "The Duke will not testify. Cedric Mordain has spent his entire life avoiding public vulnerability. He will send solicitors. He will deploy procedural defenses. He will do everything except stand in that chamber and tell the truth, because telling the truth would require admitting that he is capable of love, and that admission would destroy the only identity he has ever known." Cassian lifted his glass. "My cousin is a fortress, Mr. Graves, impressive from a distance, but every fortress has the same fatal weakness." "Which is, my lord?" "The door. You do not need to breach the walls, you only need to find the entrance no one is guarding. And Cedric's entrance has always been the same." He drank. His inability to say out loud what he actually feels. The tribunal was set. The trap was baited, and the only weapon capable of dismantling it was the one thing the Duke of Blackmere had never in his life been willing to use: his own unarmored voice. Parliament Hall smelled of wet wool and old ambition. Rain had been falling on London since before dawn, the kind of rain that does not cleanse but saturates, turning the city's limestone facades dark and slick and giving every building the appearance of something recently exhumed. Water streamed down the tall windows of the tribunal chamber and distorted the view of Westminster beyond, until the spires looked like they were melting. Inside, gas lamps burned at full intensity against the gloom, casting the vaulted ceiling in amber shadow and turning the faces of the assembled aristocracy into something from a painting no one would want to hang. 312 people filled the public gallery, every seat claimed by 6 in the morning, standing room packed by 7. The corridors outside thronged with journalists, solicitors' clerks, and the particular species of London's social parasite that feeds on the destruction of prominent families the way certain insects feed on dying trees, arriving only after the structural damage is irreversible and the collapse has become entertaining. The Lord Chancellor's Tribunal occupied the central chamber of Parliament's judicial wing, a room designed during the reign of the Second George specifically to intimidate anyone standing before it. 40-foot ceilings, oak paneling blackened by 2 centuries of coal smoke, a raised judicial bench that forced witnesses to look upward when addressing the court, a physical arrangement that converted legal testimony into something resembling supplication. Lord Cassian Mordain arrived at 20 minutes past 8. He moved through the gallery with the practiced ease of a man who understood that tribunals were won in the margins, in the whispered conversations before proceedings opened, in the calibrated placement of allies throughout the public seating, in the careful management of facial expression so that every observer received the same message before a single word of testimony was spoken. Cassian wore charcoal gray. Not black. Black would have signaled aggression. Gray communicated sorrow, reluctance, the appearance of a man forced by duty to pursue an action he found personally distasteful. His solicitor, Graves, had prepared the ground for 6 weeks. 14 witnesses scheduled. 3 barristers retained. Documentary evidence compiled into leather folios that sat on the petitioner's table like ordnance waiting for deployment. The strategy was architectural. Layer testimony upon testimony until the cumulative weight made the structure of Ceadric's defense collapse under its own contradictions. Henry Ashworth had been secured. £11,000 of gambling debt retired in exchange for testimony that would recontextualize 2 social dances into evidence of intimate familiarity. Ashworth himself sat in the 3rd row of the gallery, his face carrying the specific pallor of a man who has sold something he cannot buy back and is only now beginning to calculate the permanent cost. At 9 o'clock precisely, the Lord Chancellor entered. Lord Hartfield, 73 years old, a judicial mind so precise it had been compared to surgical instrumentation. He had presided over 11 succession disputes in his career and ruled against the sitting title holder in 9 of them, a record that had earned him the informal title of the guillotine among London's aristocratic families. He did not look at the gallery. He did not acknowledge the petitioner or the respondent. He settled into the elevated bench, arranged his papers, and spoke without preliminary. This tribunal convenes to adjudicate the petition of Lord Cassian Mordain, challenging the legitimate succession of Edmund Mordain, son of Duke Ceadric Mordain of Blackmere and Duchess Seraphina Mordain. The petitioner alleges insufficient evidence of paternal claim under the Mordain Family Charter, Section 12, Paragraph 9, concerning children conceived prior to the solemnization of marriage. The respondent is present. Ceadric sat at the respondent's table. He had not slept. Seraphina knew this because she had lain awake in the adjoining chamber of their London residence, listening to his footsteps pace the study floor from midnight until 4 in the morning, a metronome of anxiety so regular it could have kept time for an orchestra. He had emerged at dawn wearing black, not gray, not the diplomatic middle ground of a man seeking sympathy. Black, the way he had dressed at the altar, the way every Mordain duke dressed, when they intended to communicate that the occasion was not a negotiation, but a verdict. But something was different. The gloves were absent. Seraphina noticed immediately. In every public appearance she had witnessed, Ceadric wore gloves, kid leather, custom-fitted, maintained by his valet with the obsessive attention of a man who understood that his employer treated those gloves as functional components of his public identity. Bare hands were private. Gloves were the interface between the Duke and the world. Their absence this morning was not an oversight. It was a declaration. Seraphina sat directly behind the respondent's table in the 1st row of the gallery. Edmund was not present. She had left him with Mrs. Hargrove at the London house, a decision that had required overriding every maternal instinct she possessed, because bringing the child would have been strategic, and she refused to use her son as a prop in a theater designed to determine whether he was legitimate. Cassian's lead barrister rose first, Sir Roland Vetch, a man whose reputation had been built on the systematic disassembly of aristocratic defenses in succession, disputes the way a demolition engineer's reputation is built on the controlled collapse of condemned buildings. He was tall, thin, and possessed a voice calibrated to carry absolute authority without ever rising above conversational volume. My Lord Chancellor, the petitioner's case rests on a simple and demonstrable foundation. The child Edmund Mordain was conceived outside the bonds of marriage. The Duke of Blackmere was absent from England for the entirety of his wife's pregnancy, and testimony will establish that the Duchess maintained a private association with Lord Henry Ashworth in the months preceding the engagement, an association whose nature raises material questions about the paternity of the child now presented as the Mordain heir. The words settled into the chamber like sediment into water. Every face in the gallery processed them differently, but the aggregate effect was uniform. Doubt. Not about the facts, which were largely irrelevant to most of those present, but about the outcome. The tribunal suddenly felt like a mechanism already in motion, its conclusion predetermined by the sheer institutional weight of the accusation. Vetch continued for 11 minutes. He was methodical, precise. He laid out the evidentiary framework with the dispassionate clarity of a man presenting architectural blueprints, each element supporting the next, each witness positioned to reinforce the structural argument that Edmund Mordain's claim to the Blackmere succession could not survive scrutiny. Then he called Henry Ashworth to the stand. Ashworth rose from the third row. Serafina watched him walk toward the witness bench. His gait betrayed him immediately. Too rigid, too controlled. The movement of a man whose body understood that what his mouth was about to do constituted a form of violence and was protesting at the muscular level. His hands hung at his sides, but his fingers opened and closed in small, unconscious spasms that anyone trained to read physiological stress would have recognized as the body's attempt to discharge anxiety through peripheral movement. He took the oath. Vetch approached him. Lord Ashworth, you were acquainted with Lady Serafina Vale before her marriage to the Duke of Blackmere. I was. In what capacity? Social. We moved in overlapping circles. The Pemberton gatherings, Lady Whitmore's autumn salon, the usual London season events. And during these occasions, did you engage in private conversation with Lady Serafina? Ashworth's eyes moved. Not toward Serafina, not toward Caedric, toward a point on the far wall that offered the psychological equivalent of a blank surface onto which he could project whatever version of himself was required to survive the next 10 minutes. We spoke, on several occasions. And the nature of these conversations? Personal. She was. She seemed isolated. Her family's financial difficulties were well known. She confided certain anxieties about her future. Serafina's fingers pressed into her thighs beneath the folds of her skirt. The fabrication was elegant, close enough to reality that it carried the architecture of truth. She had been isolated. Her family's finances had been catastrophic, but she had never confided anything to Henry Ashworth. Not one word. The man was constructing intimacy from proximity, building a house on a foundation of geographical coincidence and social obligation. Vetch pressed forward. Lord Ashworth, I must ask you directly, did your relationship with Lady Serafina extend beyond social conversation? The chamber held its breath. Ashworth swallowed. There were moments of closeness. That could have been interpreted as, please be specific, Lord Ashworth. She took my arm during a garden walk at the Pemberton estate. We were alone for approximately 15 minutes. The conversation was intimate in tone. The gallery rustled. 300 people performing the collective theater of scandal absorption, the widened eyes, the leaned whispers, the small satisfied exhalations of an audience receiving exactly the narrative it came to consume. Serafina felt her pulse in her teeth. She had never walked in any garden with Henry Ashworth. The lie was specific enough to sound testified and vague enough to resist direct contradiction. A 15-minute walk. No witnesses. His word against hers. Caedric sat motionless. His barrister, a man named Thornton, whose strategy had been built entirely around procedural defense and documentary rebuttal, began shuffling papers with the specific anxiety of a legal mind recognizing that the terrain had shifted beneath his prepared position. The surveillance reports Caedric had mentioned, the ones that exonerated Serafina completely, were powerful documents, But deploying them meant admitting publicly that the Duke had surveilled his own wife, which would create a separate narrative of controlling behavior that Cassian's team could exploit with devastating effectiveness. A trap within a trap. Every defensive move carried its own offensive vulnerability. Thornton leaned toward Cadric. "Your Grace, I strongly advise against personal testimony. We can rebut through documentation and character witnesses without exposing you to cross-examination." "No." "Your Grace," I said no. The exchange was whispered, but Seraphina caught every word. She watched Cadric's profile. The jaw set like quarry stone. The eyes fixed on a middle distance that existed somewhere between the witness stand and the far wall, calculating trajectories the way she imagined artillery officers calculate range, accounting for wind, elevation, the curvature of the earth, every variable that separates intention from impact. Vetch finished with Ashworth after 23 minutes. The testimony hung in the chamber like smoke. Lord Hartfield looked toward the respondent's table. The respondent may cross-examine the witness or present its own evidence. Thornton began to rise. Cadric put his hand on the barrister's arm. "I will speak." The entire chamber recalibrated. Thornton's face drained of color. 300 gallery observers shifted forward in their seats simultaneously, producing a collective creak of wood and fabric that sounded like the hull of a ship adjusting to a change in current. Cassian, who had maintained an expression of calibrated sorrow throughout Ashworth's testimony, went completely still. Something had deviated from his projections. Cadric stood. He did not move to the witness stand. He stepped forward from the respondent's table into the open floor between the bench and the gallery, a space that protocol typically reserved for barristers. The Lord Chancellor's eyebrow lifted 1 millimeter. "Your Grace, if you wish to testify, you must take the stand." "I am not testifying, my Lord Chancellor. I am making a statement. If the court will permit me 3 minutes, I believe I can resolve this matter without requiring further testimony from anyone." Hartfield studied him for a long moment. The guillotine had seen every tactical variation the aristocracy could produce over 4 decades of judicial service. Men who wept strategically, men who raged, men who deployed silence like a weapon, and men who weaponized verbosity until the court surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. But he had never seen a respondent abandon his legal counsel and step onto the open floor unshielded. 3 minutes, Your Grace. The court's patience is not unlimited." Cadric turned. Not toward the Lord Chancellor, not toward Cassian, not toward the gallery. He turned toward Seraphina. That single movement reorganized every assumption in the room. "I married this woman 6 months ago in front of 200 people and told her publicly that she was a transaction. I said it because it was easier than saying the truth, which is that I was marrying someone who frightened me more than any adversary I have ever faced. Not because she threatened my power, because she threatened my solitude. And my solitude was the only structure I had left after my father spent my entire childhood teaching me that connection was weakness and affection was strategic liability." His voice carried through the chamber without effort. Not because he was projecting, because the room had gone so silent that even breathing seemed intrusive. "I left her the morning after our wedding. I traveled to the continent while she carried my child alone through winter to a fortress I had abandoned because living inside it meant confronting the memory of the only person who ever loved me without conditions. My mother, who died when I was 9, whose letters I kept locked in a tower room because reading them made me feel things that my father told me would destroy me." The gallery did not move. "Lord Ashworth's testimony is a lie, purchased by my cousin for the price of a gambling debt. I know this because I had my wife surveilled from the day our engagement was formalized. Every social engagement, every conversation, every caller documented by hired investigators whose reports I still possess and will submit to this court if required. Those reports confirm that Seraphina Vale never engaged in any private association with Henry Ashworth or any other man. The garden walk described in testimony did not occur. It was fabricated by a man who owed £11,000 to creditors and was offered financial rescue in exchange for perjury. He did not look at Ashworth. He did not look at Cassian. He kept his eyes on Seraphina. I have spent my entire life converting every human emotion into something I could control. I turned grief into discipline. I turned loneliness into authority. I turned the desire to be loved into the machinery of being feared, because fear was predictable and love was not. And a man raised by a monster learns very early that predictability is the only form of safety available. His bare hands hung at his sides. No gloves, no armor, no barrier between the man and the room. This child is mine. He was conceived by me. He was carried by a woman I did not deserve and delivered in a storm I rode through because the thought of her dying without me present was the first thing in 35 years that made me understand what my mother meant when she wrote that strength without tenderness is just a more sophisticated form of destruction. He reached into his coat and produced a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. These are the letters my housekeeper sent to me in Paris during my absence. 47 letters documenting every change my wife made to Blackmere during the months I was too much of a coward to return. I read every one. I responded to none because I did not know how to say what I felt without dismantling the person I had built. But I kept them. All of them. And they constitute a documentary record of a man paying attention to his wife and child from the other side of Europe because he could not stop himself, even though everything he had been taught told him that caring was the most dangerous thing he could do. He set the letters on the judicial bench. My cousin wants this duchy. He has wanted it since we were children. This tribunal is not about Edmund's legitimacy. It is about Cassian's ambition, and I will not allow my son to become collateral damage in a succession war between two men whose family taught them that power matters more than people. He turned toward the Lord Chancellor. I have nothing else. Whatever this court decides, I have said what is true. For the first time in my life, in front of people who will judge me for it, I have said what is true without calculating whether truth would help or hurt. My mother asked me to do that in the last letter she wrote before she died. It took me 26 years, but I have done it. He sat down. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room processing information. It was the silence of 300 people who had arrived expecting demolition and instead witnessed something none of them had a framework to categorize. The Duke of Blackmere, the man Parliament feared for his ruthless political calculus, the man whose name silenced banquet halls and bent ministerial committees, had just stripped himself of every defense mechanism he possessed in front of the most powerful judicial body in England. Cassian's face was a study in recalculation. The sorrow was gone. The gray suit suddenly looked like what it was, costume. And beneath the costume, the machinery of a man whose entire strategy had been predicated on a single assumption was seizing violently. Kedrick would not testify. Kedrick would never expose himself publicly. Kedrick would send lawyers, deploy procedure, fight from behind institutional walls the way Mordain men always fought. But Kedrick had not fought. He had surrendered. And in surrendering, he had made every prepared countermeasure in Cassian's arsenal irrelevant, because you cannot attack a fortification that has voluntarily opened its gates and invited you to examine every room. Vetch leaned toward Cassian. We can still proceed with the remaining witnesses. The documentary challenge to the charter remains viable regardless of— Shut up. My lord, I said shut up. Lord Hartfield looked at the gallery. His expression was unreadable, which was itself information, because the guillotine's unreadable face was the one he wore when he was recalculating a verdict he had already reached before proceedings began. He looked at the letters on the bench. He looked at Ashworth, who had begun sweating through his shirt collar with a thoroughness that suggested his autonomic nervous system had received intelligence his conscious mind had not yet processed. He looked at Cassian. Lord Mordain, does the petitioner wish to cross-examine the Duke's statement or present rebuttal evidence? Cassian stood slowly. Every eye in the chamber tracked him. He was a man whose entire political career had been built on the capacity to read rooms and respond with the precise calibration required to extract maximum advantage from any configuration of power. He could read this room. The gallery had shifted. The emotional topography of 300 observers had been reshaped by Kedrick's testimony into terrain that no longer supported the offensive strategy Cassian had prepared. But Cassian Mordain had not survived 15 years in Parliament by retreating from difficult positions. My Lord Chancellor, he said. His voice was controlled, measured, every syllable placed with the deliberation of a man laying mines. The Duke's statement, while dramatic, does not address the legal foundation of this petition. The Mordain family charter is explicit. A child conceived before marriage requires formal proof of paternity beyond the father's assertion. Emotional testimony, however compelling, does not satisfy the statutory requirement of corroborating evidence. He was right. Serafina felt the shift immediately. The emotional momentum Kedrick had generated was enormous. But Cassian was not fighting on emotional terrain. He was fighting on procedural ground. And procedural ground did not care about honesty or vulnerability or the contents of 47 letters. Procedural ground cared about statutes and standards of evidence and the specific language of a family charter written 2 centuries ago by men who designed succession law to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Lord Hartfield nodded slowly. The petitioner raises a valid procedural point. The court requires corroborating evidence of paternity beyond the respondent's personal testimony. Does the respondent possess such evidence? Kedrick's barrister looked at him with naked desperation. The chamber waited. And then Serafina stood. Every head turned. She had not planned to speak. She had come to the tribunal as a witness, as support, as the visible proof that the Duke of Blackmere had a wife who stood beside him. But Cassian's procedural maneuver had exposed the gap in Kedrick's defense, and the gap was exactly the size of one additional piece of evidence that no one in the chamber knew she possessed. My Lord Chancellor, Hartfield looked at her, I am not a party to these proceedings, but if the court permits, I believe I can provide the corroborating evidence the petitioner has correctly identified as necessary. Cassian's composure cracked. Not much. A fault line through marble. Hartfield studied her for 3 seconds. The court will hear the Duchess. Briefly. Serafina stepped forward onto the open floor where Kedrick had stood minutes before. She could feel his eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of 300 gazes calculating, measuring, categorizing. She could feel the particular density of a room that has been conditioned to dismiss women as decorative participants in proceedings designed by men to determine the fate of children those women bore in agony. She felt all of it, and none of it mattered. 6 weeks ago, I discovered a set of surveillance reports commissioned by my husband. Reports that documented my social activities for 4 months prior to our marriage. I did not know these reports existed until the Duke revealed them to me after the birth of our son. She paused. I have since obtained those reports directly from the investigators who compiled them. They are here. She produced a leather case from beneath her cloak. 37 pages of documented observation confirming that I had no private association with Henry Ashworth or any other man during the period in question. Dated, signed by the investigating agents, corroborated by their employer's records. She placed the case on the judicial bench beside Kedrick's letters. But that is not the evidence I wish to present. The chamber went absolutely still. Serafina opened the case and removed a single sheet of paper. This is a financial record obtained by Lady Celestine Artois from the Banque de Lyon 3 days ago. It documents a transfer of £11,000 from a trust account controlled by Lord Cassian Mordain to the personal accounts of Lord Henry Ashworth. The transfer was executed on the 14th of January, 9 days before Lord Ashworth's testimony was filed with this court. The sound that moved through the gallery was not a gasp. It was the sound of 300 people simultaneously understanding that they had been watching the wrong chess match entirely. Cassian's face went white. Hartfield took the document. He read it once, then again. Then he looked up at Cassian with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years presiding over the worst behavior the aristocracy can produce and has just encountered something that still manages to offend him. Lord Mordain, this document appears to establish a direct financial connection between the petitioner and the petitioner's primary witness. The court will require an immediate explanation. Cassian did not answer. His solicitor gripped his arm. Ashworth, in the 3rd row, had gone the color of canal water, and Serafina stood on the open floor of Parliament's tribunal chamber, 5 feet from the judicial bench, holding the future of her son and her husband and the entire Mordain dynasty in the steady hands of a woman who had walked into a cathedral alone 6 months ago and had not stopped walking since. The Lord Chancellor leaned forward. Lord Mordain, the court is waiting. Cassian did not answer for 11 seconds. 11 seconds inside a tribunal chamber is geological time, long enough for 300 observers to exhaust every charitable interpretation of silence and arrive collectively at the only remaining explanation, which is that the man standing before the judicial bench has nothing to say, because everything he could say would accelerate his own destruction. Serafina counted those seconds against the rhythm of her own pulse. She had learned to measure time that way during labor, during the blizzard, during the long frozen weeks alone at Blackmere, when the clock on the mantle seemed to move through hours, the way glaciers move through valleys, with imperceptible violence. Cassian's solicitor, Graves, reached for his arm a second time. Cassian pulled free. My Lord Chancellor, his voice had changed. The calibrated sorrow was gone. The diplomatic gray tone that had characterized his entire presentation had been stripped away by 11 seconds of silence, and what remained underneath was something rawer, something closer to the actual machinery of the man. The financial transfer referenced by the Duchess is a private matter between myself and Lord Ashworth concerning a long-standing personal debt. It has no bearing on these proceedings. The timing suggests otherwise, Hartfield said. Timing is circumstantial, my lord, not evidentiary. That determination belongs to this court, Lord Mordain, not to the petitioner. Hartfield set the banking document beside the surveillance reports and the 47 letters. 3 stacks of evidence arranged on the judicial bench like the components of a detonation sequence. The court will recess for 1 hour to examine the materials submitted. During that recess, Lord Ashworth will remain available for recall. Any attempt to leave these premises before the court reconvenes will be treated as contempt. The gavel struck once. The chamber erupted into the particular chaos that follows the collapse of a controlled narrative, 300 voices releasing simultaneously the tension that had been accumulating since Cedric first stepped onto the open floor. The sound was not conversation, it was pressure equalization. The acoustic equivalent of a sealed chamber suddenly opened to atmosphere. Serafina returned to her seat. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there until the tremor subsided, a technique she had developed during the weeks at Blackmere, when the isolation became so complete that her body began producing anxiety her mind refused to acknowledge. The hands always betrayed her first. Everything else she could control. The voice, the posture, the expression calibrated to communicate whatever the situation required. But the hands operated on a different circuit, one connected directly to the animal machinery beneath the social architecture, and that machinery did not care about composure or strategy or the appearance of strength. It cared about survival. Cedric leaned toward her without turning his head. "Where did you get the banking record?" "Lady Celestine." "I did not ask her to." "I did. 3 days ago. When you were preparing your testimony, I contacted her through a courier Mrs. Hargrove recommended. I told her that Cassian's case depended entirely on purchase testimony and that the only way to prove the purchase was through the financial transaction that funded it. And she obtained the record from the Banque de Lyon in 3 days. She obtained it in 36 hours. She is, as you mentioned, very formidable." Cedric exhaled. Not a sigh. Something structural. The controlled release of pressure from a system that had been operating beyond its design tolerances. "You built a secondary defense without telling me. You built a surveillance operation without telling me. Consider us, even." He turned his head and looked at her fully. The expression on his face was not gratitude, though gratitude was present somewhere in the architecture. It was recognition. The specific recognition that occurs when a person trained to operate alone discovers that someone else has been running parallel calculations toward the same objective. Not as a subordinate executing orders, but as an equal, reading the same battlefield and arriving at complementary conclusions through independent analysis. "We are not even," he said quietly. "We will never be even. What you did at that altar cost you more than anything I have ever risked in my life, because you had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you did it in front of 300 people who wanted to watch you fail. I did not do it for the gallery." "I know. That is precisely the point." The recess lasted 73 minutes. During that time, Serafina watched the political ecosystem of the gallery reorganize itself in real time. Alliances that had solidified around Cassian's petition began liquefying as the implications of the banking document spread through whispered channels from row to row. Lord Pemberton, who had arrived seated beside Cassian's allies in the 4th row, relocated to the 7th row beside neutral observers. Lady Ashworth, whose commentary at the wedding reception had helped establish the social narrative of Serafina's humiliation, left the chamber entirely and did not return. 3 members of the Privy Council, who had been tracking the tribunal as a barometer of Blackmere's political stability, exchanged a series of glances that communicated in the silent language of men who have managed institutional power for decades, a collective recalculation of which Mordain represented the safer long-term investment. Henry Ashworth sat in the 3rd row and did not move. He stared at the floor between his feet with the particular focus of a man performing mental arithmetic on a debt that cannot be repaid in any currency he possesses. Serafina watched him and felt something she had not expected. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something closer to exhaustion. The fatigue that follows extended combat when the adrenaline metabolizes and the body begins cataloging its actual condition, the torn muscles, the depleted reserves, the accumulated cost of sustained crisis that only becomes visible when the crisis begins to recede. Ashworth was a weak man. Not evil, not calculated. Weak in the specific way that men become weak when their vices exceed their resources, and they discover that the marketplace for human dignity operates on the same supply and demand principles as every other market. Cassian had found a man whose price was denominated in pounds sterling and paid it. The transaction was ugly, but it was also, Serafina understood, ordinary. The world ran on transactions like this. The powerful purchased cooperation from the desperate. The desperate sold whatever they had left. And somewhere in the gap between the purchase and the sale, truth became a commodity whose value fluctuated depending on who needed it and how much they were willing to pay. The gavel struck again at 14 minutes past 11. Hartfield returned to the bench. The chamber settled into silence with the speed of water finding its level. "The court has examined the submitted materials," Hartfield said. "The surveillance reports commissioned by the Duke of Blackmere provide dated, corroborated documentation of the Duchess's social activities for the period in question. These reports contradict the testimony of Lord Ashworth on multiple specific points, including the alleged garden walk at the Pemberton estate, which the surveillance records indicate did not occur." He paused. "Additionally, the financial record submitted by the Duchess establishes a direct monetary transfer from the petitioner to the petitioner's primary witness in the period immediately preceding the filing of that witness's testimony. While the petitioner characterizes this transfer as a private debt settlement, the court finds the timing sufficiently proximate to the proceedings to warrant serious concern regarding the integrity of the testimony provided." Hartfield looked at Cassian. "Lord Mordain, the court offers you the opportunity to withdraw the petition. If you do so now, the matter will be recorded as voluntarily dismissed, and no further action will be taken regarding the financial record." The offer was surgical. Hartfield was giving Cassian an exit, not because the Lord Chancellor felt merciful, but because pursuing the financial connection to its logical conclusion would mean a formal investigation into witness tampering, which would consume parliamentary resources, generate months of additional proceedings, and damage the institutional credibility of the tribunal system itself. The guillotine was not protecting Cassian. He was protecting the machinery. Cassian stood very still. The room waited. Serafina watched his face and saw something she recognized from the tower room at Blackmere. The same expression she had seen in the earliest charcoal sketches, the ones drawn by a child whose lines were heavy with pressure and whose subjects were always rendered in isolation. Ships alone on empty seas, horses running through empty moorland, a mother drawn from memory because the original was gone. The Mordain face, the family architecture, built for endurance rather than connection, designed to withstand siege rather than welcome entry. Cassian wore it now, the face of a man whose fortress had been breached and who was calculating whether to surrender the gate or set fire to the interior and destroy everything rather than allow the enemy to occupy what he had built. "I withdraw the petition," he said. 4 words. Delivered without inflection, without emotion, without the slightest tremor in a voice that had been calibrated for political performance since adolescence. He said it the way a man cuts off a gangrenous limb, with the understanding that the loss is catastrophic, but the alternative is worse. Hartfield nodded. "The petition of Lord Cassian Mordain is hereby dismissed. The succession of Edmund Mordain, son of Duke Cedric Mordain of Blackmere, and Duchess Serafina Mordain, is affirmed without reservation. This tribunal is concluded." The gavel struck for the final time. The sound echoed through the chamber and died against the rain-streaked windows, and dissolved into the ambient noise of 300 people rising from their seats and beginning the complex social choreography of departure, which in aristocratic London serves as the primary mechanism for redistributing political allegiance after a public shift in power dynamics. Cassian left the chamber without speaking to anyone. He walked through the gallery with the rigid precision of a man whose skeletal system is the only thing preventing collapse. Each step mechanically executed, each joint locked against the gravitational pull of a defeat so complete it had restructured the political landscape he would inhabit for the remainder of his career. Graves followed 3 steps behind, carrying the leather folios that now contained nothing except the documented architecture of a strategy that had failed not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed to fight a version of Cedric Mordain that no longer existed. The man Cassian had prepared to fight, the fortress, The Duke who would never expose himself publicly, the cousin whose emotional defenses were so calcified that vulnerability was structurally impossible, that man had been Cassian's most reliable intelligence asset for 15 years. Every plan he had ever constructed against Blackmere had been built on the foundation of Kaedric's predictability. His certainty that the Duke would always choose institutional defense over personal exposure. His absolute confidence that the man raised by a monster would continue behaving like one because that was the only behavioral template available. Cassian had not been defeated by evidence. He had been defeated by transformation. By the possibility, which his entire strategic framework had categorized as negligible, that a man might change. Outside the tribunal, the rain had stopped. London emerged from the storm the way cities always emerge from storms. Slowly, reluctantly, as though the infrastructure itself needs to verify that the worst has actually passed before committing to normalcy. Puddles reflected a sky that was shifting from charcoal to pale silver. Carriages began moving through streets that had been nearly empty since morning. The gas lights along Westminster Bridge dimmed as the natural light strengthened, creating a brief interval during which the city existed in both illumination systems simultaneously, the old and the new overlapping before one surrendered to the other. Kaedric and Seraphina stood in the corridor outside the tribunal chamber. The crowd flowed around them. Solicitors, journalists, aristocrats performing the post-verdict calculations that would determine dinner invitations and political alignments for the coming season. None of them stopped. None of them spoke. The Duke and Duchess of Blackmere occupied a space that the social ecosystem had tacitly designated as private, the way a reef formation creates a pocket of still water inside a current, not because the current respects the reef, but because the physics of flow demand it. "It is over," Seraphina said. "The tribunal is over. What follows will take longer." "What follows?" "The reconstruction. Cassian's allies will need to be managed. The financial restructuring Lady Celestine arranged will need to be completed. The Mordain reputation, whatever it is now, will need to be rebuilt from materials I have never worked with before." "Which materials?" "Honesty. Consistency. The things you have been using since the day you arrived at Blackmere. I watched you do it for weeks through Mrs. Hargrove's letters, and I could not understand how you were producing results that I had failed to produce in 15 years of applying power to the same problems. The tenants, the staff, the village. You made them loyal, not obedient, loyal. And you did it without threatening anyone, without leveraging debt or exploiting dependency. You simply showed up and told the truth and did what you said you would do." He paused. "That is a technology I was never taught. My father's curriculum did not include it." "It is not a technology, Kaedric. It is just decency." Decency. He repeated the word as though testing a tool he had never held, turning it over, examining its weight, its balance, its fitness for the work ahead. "My father would have called that a vulnerability." "Your father is dead." His definitions expired with him. The carriage ride back to the London house took 20 minutes. They sat across from each other in the enclosed cab while the city moved past the windows, and the silence between them had completed its final transformation. It was no longer the silence of avoidance, no longer the silence of preparation. It was the silence of two people who have survived something together and are sitting inside the aftermath without needing to fill it with language, because the experience itself has said everything that language could approximate, and both of them understand that some forms of knowledge are better held than spoken. When they arrived at the house, Mrs. Hargrove met them at the door. Her expression communicated the verdict before either of them spoke. She had received word from the tribunal through channels that Seraphina suspected were older and more reliable than any formal communication network. The invisible infrastructure of domestic intelligence that connected every great household in London through a web of servants, cooks, drivers, and laundresses whose collective surveillance capacity exceeded that of any governmental agency. "Edmund is sleeping," Mrs. Hargrove said. "He took his feed at 10 and has been quiet since." "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove." "Your Grace." The housekeeper addressed Kaedric directly, and something in her voice carried a weight that exceeded the ordinary dimensions of domestic communication. "I served your mother for 11 years. I have served this household for 30. Today is the first day I have been proud to do so." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Kaedric watched her go. She waited 30 years to say that. She waited 30 years for it to be true. They climbed the stairs to the nursery. Edmund lay in a travel cradle beside the window, wrapped in the ivory silk blanket from Blackmere, breathing with the shallow, rapid rhythm of a newborn, whose entire experience of the world consisted of warmth, milk, sleep, and the occasional protest against conditions he lacked the vocabulary to specify. The room was quiet. Late morning light filtered through lace curtains and fell across the cradle in patterns that shifted as clouds moved across the clearing sky outside. Kedrick stood beside the cradle and looked down at his son. The last time he had held this child was the night of the storm. The night he had ridden through a blizzard and arrived at Blackmere covered in snow and terror and knelt beside Seraphina's bed and spoken words that had been locked inside him for decades. He had held Edmund for perhaps 20 minutes that night, 20 minutes during which the entire architecture of his interior life had undergone the kind of catastrophic reorganization that occurs when a load-bearing wall is removed and the structure has to redistribute stress across members that were never designed to carry it. He reached into the cradle. The child stirred. His face contracted into the preliminary geometry of displeasure that precedes infant crying, a sequence Kedrick had observed precisely twice in his life, and which still produced in him a response so disproportionate to the stimulus that it confirmed everything his father had ever warned him about: the danger of attachment, the vulnerability of caring, the way love converts a sovereign human being into a hostage, whose ransom is permanent and whose captor is a 7-pound creature incapable of understanding the power it holds. Edmund opened his eyes. He looked at his father. He did not cry. "I stood in a tribunal today," Kedrick said to the infant, "and I told 300 people things I have never told anyone. Told them about your grandmother, about the letters she wrote, about the tower room where I hid because it was the only place in the world that still contained her. I told them that I married your mother because she terrified me, and I humiliated her because I could not tolerate the possibility that she might reach the part of me that still remembered how to feel, because feeling had been classified as lethal in the household I grew up in, the way certain chemicals are classified as hazardous, not because they are inherently dangerous, but because the people who handle them lack the training to do so safely." Edmund's hand found Kedrick's finger and gripped it. "I lack the training. That is the most accurate summary of my first 35 years I can produce. I was given power without instruction, authority without wisdom. A duchy without the emotional infrastructure required to govern anything, including myself. And the result was predictable. I governed through fear because fear was the only administrative tool in my inventory. I maintained control through distance because proximity meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant destruction, and destruction meant becoming the thing my mother begged me not to become in letters. I kept locked in a room because reading them made me human, and being human in this family was never safe." He lifted the child from the cradle and held him against his chest. "You will not inherit that. I cannot guarantee you will inherit wisdom or kindness or the ability to navigate this world without causing damage, because I have no evidence that those qualities are genetically transmissible and considerable evidence that they are not. But I can guarantee you will not inherit the specific belief that destroyed every Mordain who came before you. The belief that love is weakness, that tenderness is liability, that the only safe way to move through life is behind walls thick enough to keep everything out, including the things that make life worth defending in the first place." Seraphina stood in the doorway. She had been listening. She did not announce herself because announcement would have broken whatever was happening in that room. And what was happening in that room was something she understood instinctively could not be interrupted without cost. A man was talking to his son, not performing fatherhood for an audience, not executing a scripted domestic scene designed to communicate reformation to an observer. Talking to a child who could not understand the words and did not need to, because the words were not for the child. They were for the man speaking them. The act of saying out loud to another living person, however small and however incapable of comprehension, the truths that had been locked inside a tower room for 30 years. The truth that he had been broken by a father who mistook cruelty for curriculum. That he had been saved, partially and imperfectly, by a mother whose letters constituted the only education in humanity he had ever received. That he had married a woman he did not deserve and driven her away because her presence illuminated rooms he had spent his entire life keeping dark. That he was afraid, still afraid, not of tribunals or political rivals or the complex mechanics of succession law, afraid of the thing he was holding in his arms, afraid of the weight of it, the permanence, The absolute irreversibility of loving something that could be taken away by fever, by accident, by the same arbitrary cruelty that had taken his mother and left him with nothing but charcoal sketches and 17 letters, and the sound of wind against stone walls that had never been warm. Serafina entered the room. She did not speak. She crossed to where he stood and placed her hand against the back of his neck and left it there. And the gesture was so simple and so small that it should not have carried the weight it carried, but it did, because some gestures derive their significance not from their scale, but from their timing. And the timing of this one was precise enough to reach the exact location where 35 years of accumulated solitude had calcified into something that felt permanent, but was not. Nothing permanent had happened in that nursery. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would survive retelling at dinner parties or appear in the social columns of the London newspapers or be recorded by historians as a pivotal moment in the saga of the Mordaunt dynasty. A man held his son. A woman touched the man's neck. A child breathed between them. The afternoon light shifted across the floor. Spring arrived at Blackmere 6 weeks later. The return journey north felt different in ways that resisted simple description. The same road. The same hedgerows giving way to moorland, giving way to black soil and stripped rock. The same sky pressing low against the earth as the carriage climbed toward the coast. But the interior atmosphere had changed. Serafina sat beside Cedric rather than across from him. Edmund slept in a travel cradle wedged between the seats. Mrs. Hargrove and Briggs followed in a second carriage with the household luggage and the 47 letters which Cedric had requested be returned to him after the tribunal. When Blackmere Keep materialized on the cliff face, Serafina did not feel the visceral dread that had accompanied her first approach. The fortress looked the same. The towers still disappeared into low cloud. The causeway still stretched across the drop to the churning sea below. The stone was still dark, still 12 feet thick in places, still radiating the particular hostility of architecture designed to make human beings feel insignificant. But smoke rose from 3 chimneys. Light glowed behind windows that had been dark for years. And at the causeway gate, 14 staff members stood waiting, not in rigid formation, not with the blank faces of servants trained through fear. They stood in the loose, slightly disorganized arrangement of people who had assembled voluntarily because they wanted to be present. And when the carriage stopped and the Duke stepped out carrying his son, something happened that had not happened at Blackmere Keep in living memory. Someone began clapping. Then another person, then a third. It spread through the small assembly with the tentative, accelerating rhythm of an event that has never occurred before and whose participants are discovering in real time that it is permitted. Not commanded, not performed for strategic purposes. Permitted. The authentic, unrehearsed expression of people who have watched a household transform from something they endured into something they inhabited, and who are now welcoming back the man whose absence had been the original wound. Cedric stopped on the causeway. He stood there with Edmund against his chest and the wind off the North Sea pressing against his back, and the sound of applause, thin and fragile and utterly unprecedented in the history of his family, reaching him across the gap between the carriage and the gate. Serafina watched his face. He did not cry. He was not, and would likely never become, a man whose emotional expression included visible tears. But something moved behind his features that she had learned to read during the months of proximity and silence and gradual, incremental disclosure. A recalculation. Not strategic, structural. The redistribution of internal load that occurs when a man who has carried everything alone discovers that the ground beneath him has been reinforced by people he did not ask for help and who provided it anyway. He walked through the gate. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the specific way that genuine transformation is always unremarkable. No single dramatic moment, no climactic confrontation, no scene that would satisfy the requirements of narrative architecture. Just the slow, patient, daily labor of 2 people learning to occupy the same space without the defensive mechanisms that had characterized their cohabitation from the beginning. Cedric opened the West Wing, not symbolically, not through a formal ceremony or a grand domestic gesture. He simply told Mrs. Hargrove to unlock the doors and air the rooms and make the tower chamber accessible. The charcoal sketches remained on the walls. The wooden soldiers stayed on the table. Eleanor's letters were returned to their ribbon-bound bundle and placed in a glass case that Serafina commissioned from a craftsman in the village, not as a memorial, but as an archive, something to be visited rather than hidden, honored rather than locked away. The glass houses on the southern face of the castle produced their first full crop in June. Tomatoes, lettuces, herbs that scented the kitchen corridors with rosemary, thyme, and basil. The kitchen garden Serafina had planted during her earliest weeks expanded into terraced beds that cascaded down the sheltered cliff face in geometric patterns that were visible from the sea. Villagers continued arriving, not for shelter now, but for employment. Blackmere's restored economy generated work that had not existed for decades, and the settlements below the cliffs began expanding for the first time in a generation. A schoolhouse was established in a converted storehouse near the Causeway Gate. A physician's office opened in the village proper, funded by the estate and staffed by Dr. Ashton, who had decided that the northern coast suited him better than the gentler landscapes he had left behind. On a warm evening in late June, Kedrick found Serafina in the tower room. She sat in the window seat with the shutters open for the first time, looking out across the North Sea toward a horizon that stretched unbroken in every direction. The sky was enormous, pale gold shading into deep blue, the kind of sky that exists only at the intersection of ocean and high latitude, where the light travels such vast distances that it arrives exhausted and gentle and somehow more honest than light that has not had to work as hard. Edmund lay sleeping in her arms. Kedrick leaned against the doorframe. "I used to sit in that exact position," he said, "when I was small enough that the window seat held me. I would watch the water and pretend the ships I saw were coming for me, that someone aboard one of them knew I was here and was crossing the distance to take me somewhere warmer." "Did you draw them? The ships?" "Everyone. From memory. I would watch until they disappeared past the headland, and then I would draw them on the wall so they would still exist somewhere even after the sea took them." Serafina looked at the sketches surrounding her. Hundreds of ships, rendered in charcoal by a hand that had started uncertain and childish, and gradually developed into something technically accomplished, each vessel carrying the weight of a boy's loneliness across imaginary oceans toward destinations that existed nowhere except on these walls. "They are beautiful," she said. "They were survival. There is a difference." "Not always." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the window seat. The space was not designed for two adults. It required proximity that would have been impossible 3 months earlier, the physical closeness of bodies that had shared a bed, but not the vulnerability that makes shared space meaningful rather than merely occupied. He looked at his son, then at his wife. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am not saying it because the tribunal taught me that honesty produces better outcomes than concealment. I'm not saying it because it is strategically advantageous. I am saying it because it is true, and because I have discovered, very late and at considerable cost, that true things need to be said out loud or they calcify inside the person carrying them until the person and the secret become indistinguishable." He took her hand. "I love you. I have loved you since the moment you answered me at that altar without flinching. I did not know what it was then. I had no vocabulary for it. The only framework I possessed for understanding what I felt was my father's framework, which classified every strong emotion as a threat to be neutralized rather than an experience to be inhabited. So I neutralized it. I left. I ran. I put an entire continent between myself and the thing that frightened me, and I convinced myself that distance was the same as safety." He pressed her hand against his chest. "It is not. Distance is just the geography of cowardice, and I am done with it." Serafina looked at him for a long time. She did not say "I love you" back. Not because the words were unavailable, but because the version of love she had built during the months of solitude and reconstruction and survival was not the kind that could be summarized in a reciprocal phrase. It was structural love, load-bearing, the kind that expressed itself not through declaration, but through presence, through the daily act of showing up and doing the work and refusing to abandon the commitment even when the person at the center of it seemed determined to make abandonment the rational choice. "I know," she said. That was enough. The sun dropped below the horizon, the room filled with the particular blue-gray twilight that exists for approximately 11 minutes at the northern coast during midsummer, a light so delicate it seems almost fictional, as though the atmosphere is producing it as an apology for the months of darkness that preceded it and the months that will follow. In that light, the charcoal ships on the walls looked almost alive, almost moving, as though the wind that had carried the real vessels past the headland decades ago still circulated through the room animating their drawn counterparts with the ghost of emotion that had once meant everything to a boy who believed rescue would come from the sea. Rescue had not come from the sea. It had come from a woman who walked alone into a cathedral and did not break. Outside, the North Sea moved against the cliffs of Blackmere with the same rhythm it had maintained for millennia, indifferent to the small dramas of the people who built their fortresses along its edge. The water did not care about dynasties or succession law or the complex emotional archaeology of a family that had spent generations converting pain into power and was now, tentatively, learning to convert it into something else. But inside the tower room, a man who had spent his entire life believing that walls keep you safe sat in an open window with his wife and his son and discovered that the opposite was true. Walls do not keep you safe. They keep you alone. And the only architecture worth inheriting is the kind that lets the light in.